She called me a burden at my own retirement dinner, in front of my colleagues, in front of my grandchildren, and I just sat there, holding my fork, letting the words settle into me like a stone dropping into still water. I didn't cry, I didn't raise my voice. I picked up my napkin, folded it on the table, and told myself, remember this moment, because everything changes tonight. Let me back up. I spent 34 years as a structural engineer, bridges, mostly. A few hospital complexes, some municipal buildings out in the Midwest. My name isn't on any plaques, but if you drive across certain overpasses in Ohio and Indiana, you're driving on something I calculated, something I signed off on, something I slipped over so that it would hold. That's what I did. That's who I am. My wife, Helen, she passed 11 years ago now. Breast cancer, stage 3. We had 2 years between the diagnosis and the end, and I spent those 2 years learning how to do every single thing she used to do, because I knew I'd have to. Cooking, laundry, scheduling, remembering birthdays. We had one child together, our daughter. She was 26 when her mother died. We grieved together for a while. Then we drifted. Then she met him. My son-in-law came into our lives about 8 months after the funeral. I'm not going to pretend I wasn't skeptical. Any father would be, but I gave him a fair chance. I went to their dinners. I helped them move into their first apartment. When they got married, I paid for the wedding. Not because they asked me to, but because Helen would have wanted that. It was her daughter's wedding. I wasn't going to let it be small. They bought their house 4 years ago. A nice colonial on a quiet street in Columbus. 3 bedrooms, good school district, finished basement. My daughter mentioned they were $120,000 short on the down payment. I didn't hesitate. I transferred the money from my savings within the week. I didn't draw up a contract. I didn't ask for paperwork. She was my daughter. That's not how it works between a father and his child, or so I believed. Over the next 2 years, things were fine. Not warm exactly, but fine. My son-in-law was civil. My daughter was happy, and I visited on holidays and some weekends. I'd do small things, fix the back gate, replace a water heater, babysit my granddaughter when they needed a night out. I wasn't trying to buy their affection. I just wanted to be useful. I wanted to matter. It was around the time I announced my retirement that I first noticed the shift. I had worked until 68, 2 years longer than most of my colleagues. I announced it at Thanksgiving that the following spring I would step back, that I had enough saved, that I was looking forward to some peace. My daughter smiled, asked what I planned to do. My son-in-law said almost nothing, but later that evening, when I was in the kitchen washing up, I heard them in the hallway. I wasn't trying to listen. I just heard, if he's retired, that means no more income. That was him. He has his pension and his savings. That was her. How much savings? She didn't answer. Or maybe she answered quietly enough that I couldn't hear. I turned the faucet up a little higher and finished the dishes. I told myself I'd imagined the tone of it, that I was projecting. Over the next few months, my son-in-law started calling more. Friendly calls. Checking in, he said. How was I feeling? Was I getting out enough? Had I thought about whether the house was too big for one person? He'd read an article, he said, about older men living alone after retirement, how the isolation could really affect your health. He sounded concerned. I am 68 years old. I have lived alone for 11 years. I have done fine. But I listened. I said I appreciated the calls, and I noticed that my daughter was always in the background of those conversations, never quite on the phone herself, but there, listening. Then came the dinner. My firm threw me a retirement party at a steak restaurant downtown. 30 years of colleagues, my project manager from the early 90s, a few of the younger engineers I'd mentored. My daughter and son-in-law were there as family. My granddaughter was there too, 9 years old, and wearing a dress with tiny yellow flowers on it, because she knew I liked yellow. We were seated at a long table. The food was good. People gave small speeches. My project manager told a story about a drainage miscalculation in 1998 that I'd caught at 11 o'clock at night, and the table laughed, and I laughed too. It felt right. It felt like the kind of evening I would remember. Then there was a moment, late in the meal, when conversations split into smaller clusters. I was talking with a colleague to my left, and I heard my son-in-law's voice cut through from a few seats down. He was talking to another guest, someone's wife I didn't know well, keeping his voice low but not low enough. "He's been a lot, honestly," he was saying. "He means well, but it's like he doesn't realize that we have our own life now. And with him retiring and not having anything to fill his days, we're worried he's going to become more of a burden than he already is." A burden. I heard the word and I didn't move. The colleague beside me was still talking. I nodded like I was listening. I set my fork down very slowly so it didn't make a sound. My granddaughter was across the table coloring something on the paper placemat. She hadn't heard. I held on to that. On the drive home, I was calm. I'm telling you that because it might sound strange given what came next. But I was completely calm. I had made a decision somewhere between the soup and the dessert, and once I make a decision, the emotional part is over. That's just how I'm built. That's 34 years of engineering. You find the flaw, you correct for it, and you move on. I started with the paperwork. I have a good attorney, a man I've worked with since my wife was sick. I called him the following Monday. I told him I wanted to review every financial transaction between myself and my daughter over the past 5 years. He didn't ask why. He knew me well enough to know I wouldn't be asking unless it mattered. The down payment had been a gift, legally speaking, because I hadn't documented it as a loan. That was my own fault. But gifts can be revisited in certain circumstances, and more importantly, I had other assets that I'd been intend to eventually put in my daughter's name. A stock portfolio, a small rental property in Dayton that I'd inherited from my parents. I had mentioned these things to her casually over the years, the way you do when you're thinking about the future. Nothing was signed, nothing was legal. They were intentions, not obligations. I revised my estate plan. I removed the informal expectations I'd been operating under. I wasn't vindictive about it. I simply got precise. What was mine stayed mine. What I chose to give, I would give on my own terms and timeline if I gave it at all. Then I did something that surprised even me. I called a realtor, not for my daughter's house, for mine. I had been living in the same 4-bedroom house in Worthington for 22 years. Helen and I had bought it together, raised our daughter in it, grown into it the way people grow into a house over decades. But it was large and it was expensive to maintain, and my son-in-law's voice in my head, unpleasant as it was, not wrong about one thing. It was a lot of house for one person. I sold it. But not because they pressured me. I sold it because I had been quietly wanting to for years, and I had kept waiting for a reason, and now I had one. I used the proceeds to buy a 2-bedroom condo near downtown Columbus, close to the riverfront, on a high floor with a view I can sit in front of for an hour without noticing the time passing. I had it furnished in 3 weeks. I gave away most of what was in the house. The furniture that wasn't Helen's, the things that had accumulated without meaning. I kept what mattered. I put it in a place I could actually live in. My daughter called when she found out I'd sold the house. She was upset. She said she couldn't believe I hadn't told her. I said gently that I had made a personal decision about my own home and that I hadn't realized I needed to announce it in advance. She said she felt blindsided. I asked her if she'd felt blindsided when I handed her $120,000 without paperwork or conditions. There was a long pause. "That was different," she said. "Was it?" I said, and I left it there. A few weeks later, my son-in-law called. The friendly tone was gone. He wanted to talk about the estate plan. He had heard, apparently, through my daughter, who had heard through my attorney's assistant mentioning something she shouldn't have, that I had made changes. He wanted to know what had changed and why. I told him I preferred not to discuss my estate with him. He said he thought it was reasonable, as someone affected by the decisions, to be part of the conversation. I said he was my daughter's husband, not my financial partner, and that the conversation was between me and my attorney. He got quiet in the way people get quiet when they're deciding whether to push. Then he said, "We've done a lot for you, you know. We've had you over, we've included you, you called me a burden," I said, "at my retirement dinner." Silence. "I heard you. You didn't know I heard you, but I did." More silence. Then, "That's not. I was venting. I didn't mean." I know what you meant, I said. And I know the difference between venting and opinion. I ended the call. I want to be careful here because I know how this sounds. I know what some of you are thinking, that I cut off my daughter, that I punished her for her husband's words, that I let a moment of overheard conversation blow up a family. I want to be precise about what I actually did, because it's different from that. I did not cut off my daughter. I did not stop seeing her. I kept attending family events. I kept being her father. I called on her birthday. I showed up for my granddaughter's school play in November, and I sat in the third row, and when my granddaughter came out wearing a paper crown and looking for me in the audience, I was there, and she found me, and that was enough. But I stopped being the financial floor beneath them. I stopped operating on assumptions about what I was going to give, and when I stopped building my future around being useful to people who privately thought of me as a weight to manage. That's not punishment. That's just reality recalibrated. What I want to say about my son-in-law is this: he is not a monster. He is a man in his early 40s who is worried about money and security, like most people in their early 40s. He has a mortgage and a daughter in school, and a wife and a career that sometimes goes well and sometimes doesn't. I understand those pressures. I carried them myself for most of my adult life. But understanding someone's pressures does not mean absorbing the cost of their anxiety. And there is a difference, a significant one, between a son-in-law who is privately worried about finances and a son-in-law who describes his father-in-law as a burden at the man's own retirement party. That difference is respect, and you can feel its absence even when you can't see it. The spring after my retirement, I did something I'd been putting off for most of my adult life. I signed up for a photography course at the Columbus Museum of Art. Evening classes, 8 weeks. I'd always been interested in it. Helen had given me a camera for Christmas in 2006 that I used exactly 4 times before it went into a drawer. I dug it out. I charged it. I went to class. I was the oldest person in the room by about 15 years. The instructor was a young woman in her early 30s who knew what she was doing and taught it without condescension. There was a retired nurse in the class who ended up becoming someone I'd call a friend. There was a college student who photographed nothing but parking garages and had more genuine vision in him than most people I'd worked with professionally. I took photographs of the river, of the bridge near my condo that I crossed twice a week, of the details of old buildings, drain covers, cornices, the gaps between bricks where weeds grew through in summer. Nobody was paying me. Nobody needed me to do it. It was entirely, completely mine. I'm telling you this because I want you to understand that the story doesn't end with the confrontation. The confrontation was a door. What mattered was what I walked through it into. My daughter and I reached a kind of equilibrium over the following year. It isn't perfect. There are things between us that didn't get said, things she doesn't entirely understand about why I pulled back, things I probably could have handled with more grace. She knows about the estate revisions now, in general terms. She hasn't asked for details, and I haven't offered them. My son-in-law is polite when I see him, deliberately, almost formally polite, the way people are polite when they know they're being watched. I don't hate him. I don't particularly want anything bad to happen to him. I just don't arrange my financial life around him anymore, and I don't apologize for that. My granddaughter is 10 now. She likes to video call me on Sunday evenings and tell me about whatever book she's reading. Last month it was something about a girl who discovers her grandmother was a spy. She gave me a detailed plot summary for 25 minutes and then asked me if I thought grandparents could have secret lives. I told her I thought almost everyone had secret lives, to one degree or another. She thought about that for a second and said, "Even you?" I said, "Especially me." She laughed. She said she was going to figure out all my secrets. I told her she was welcome to try. I hung up and looked out at the river from my condo window. The light was doing something unusual, that particular low-angle late-afternoon light that makes everything look like it's been painted rather than real. I thought about getting the camera. I didn't. I just sat there and watched it for a while. There are things I would do differently. I would have documented that down payment. I would have had harder conversations earlier when the discomfort was still small enough to address directly rather than letting it build into something that had to be dismantled. I would have listened to my own instincts in that hallway at Thanksgiving instead of turning the faucet up to drown them out. But I wouldn't take back the decisions I made after the dinner. I wouldn't reclaim the house I sold, or restore the estate arrangements I revised, or return to being the man who quietly absorbed whatever was said about him, as long as the surface stayed smooth. I am 69 years old. I have a view of the river and a camera and a class on Thursday evenings, and a granddaughter who calls me on Sundays. I have a pension and a plan and more mornings than I can count that belong entirely to me, with nowhere I have to be and nothing I owe to anyone. That word, burden, it was supposed to diminish me. He said it in a crowded restaurant under his breath, thinking I couldn't hear. He said it like it was already true. I decided to make it the last true thing he ever said about me.